Parshat Yitro. Welcome back. What has it been? 3 weeks? 4 weeks? Obviously, probably I think more than anything that Parshat Yitro is known for, it's the Aseret HaDibrot. Or at least that's what we call them. Really, the term Aseret HaDibrot does not actually appear in the Torah. It's not actually that's not what the Torah calls it. It does talk about the Aseret HaDvarim, and it's only in rabbinic thought that it's called the Aseret HaDibrot. Most of us probably, if we think about it, we think of it more in terms of the English, the way it's known as the Ten Commandments, which is, for many people, it's kind of like it's probably the most famous part of the Torah, that, for the general world, right? I mean, there's the fight, in all these religious communities, they want to have, when I say religious, I mean like Christian religious, they want to have, they want to have the Ten Commandments up in the courthouse, things like that. So we know it as the Ten Commandments. The question is, though, really, are there really 10 commandments? And even if they are, what are they? Right? I mean, as we're going to see, it's not so simple that we assume, the way it's usually broken up. We look at it, there are 10 commandments, 5 on this side, 5 on this side. It's really, really not so clear. In particular, as we mentioned, before we actually got started, right? The first pasuk is Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem your God. Asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Took you out from the land of Mitzrayim. Mibeit Avadim, from the house of slavery. Look, okay, and then Lo yeh lecha Elohim achronim al panai. So, if we look at it, very simply, there's no what mitzvah is there, right? In other words, a mitzvah is usually the lashon tzivui. It usually tells you to do something. What does it say? I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. Okay, that's a statement of fact. There's no, it doesn't say, who you should believe in. It doesn't say, ta'ami. It just says simply a statement of fact. It sounds almost like an introduction. Like God is saying it, and then, Lo yeh lecha Elohim achronim al panai, you shouldn't have other gods, and then you start getting to things which are tzivuyim. You should keep Shabbat, you should not, do all these, avera, whatever it is. So the question is there a mitzvah to believe in God? Right? In other words, obviously, this does not mean, this is not the same thing. People all the time are like, what do you mean? Of course, you need God for religion. Of course. Right? I don't mean if there's no mitzvah for God, well, in that case, you can be a Jew without God. Because obviously, I mean, any Western religion that we talk about involves, a relationship with God, right? So we're saying, is there, specifically what we're getting into, is there an actual commandment, you must believe in God? Right? Now, the truth is that I want to not just talk about this specific question, but really I want to get into the whole idea of emunah in general. How does one come to emunah? What is, even if we say that there's a mitzvah, what is the mitzvah of to believe? And more importantly, what type of belief are we talking about? Because if you think about it, we're going to see there's actually at least 3 different ways that you can talk about belief. Right? Probably the one that we're the most familiar with, if we think about there's a mitzvah to believe in God, is what we call belief that. You have a certain proposition, a certain claim, and I believe that. I believe that God exists. I believe that God took us out of Egypt. I believe that God is involved in our lives. It's a proposition, and you believe that. By the way, I should just make clear that at least some of what I'm going to talk about tonight is there's a professor in Israel. He's a very interesting guy. He's a very interesting thinker. I won't say any more than that, but his name is Moshe Halbertal. And so at least, some of what I'm going to be talking about, and certainly these 3 beliefs, this is something that I heard 2 shiurim from him online. One of them is in Hebrew, one of them is in English. I mean, he's Israeli, but so the first thing, again, so a lot of this, just say things b'shem omro. Belief that, in other words, if we're going to say that there's a mitzvah, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, we have to believe that God exists, right? Okay, and so we're gonna, so that's the first approach. Is there a mitzvah? Are you commanded to believe that God exists? Now, what's strange about that? What would be so strange about such a commandment?
Why do you have to be commanded to?
Okay, what do you mean? Okay,
how can you be commanded to?
Right. So right. Well, one might be why do you have to be, and second, how can you be commanded? Right. I mean, as we're going to see, there's one rishon in particular who's going to go against the general flow of it being a mitzvah. But how can you command somebody to believe something? Right. In other words, I mean, certainly we think of belief as something that is not within our control. Right. Like if I said to you, like, I command you to believe that 2 + 2 is 5, you can't. Like even if you wanted to listen to that person, it's just, but I don't. In other words, you can pretend you do, you can say the words, but to actually believe it, belief is generally not within your control, right? And really the other way also. Even 2 + 2 = 4. You don't have a choice, right? In other words, belief suggests a choice. It's a fact. In other words, like you really have no choice there. It's not like oh well, let me think about it. Okay, I guess I believe it. I mean, it's something which you have to do. So can there be a concept of a mitzvah to believe? So and even if there was, one of the questions that gets asked, and we're going to see this. I mean, it's literally been asked from at least the Middle Ages through today is, okay, let's say there is a mitzvah to believe, and you don't, right? Like, well, now what? Like, what are you supposed to do? In other words, like, if there's a mitzvah to lift up the lulav, so you pick it up, you do the mitzvah. But in other words, like, how does one, let's say, of course it's paradoxical, because if you don't believe, then who's commanding you? I mean, it's kind of like this. But let's say somehow we get past that. How does, is it possible to, come to it, to believe something that you didn't believe before, to choose to believe a certain fact? So the truth is, again, as I said, most rishonim, it seems, believe that there is actually a mitzvah, and to believe in God, right? I mean, at least we could talk about a lot of them, but we're gonna focus on at least 3 rishonim. One of them is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Right? You probably were forced to at least read some of his poems or hear some of his poems or whatever it was that you did during class when his poems were being read. But in addition to being a famous Hebrew poet, right, Anochi b'mizrach, right? What is it? Anochi b'mizrach, Anochi b'sof ma'arav, right? So that's Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. But he's also, I guess on a Torah level, he's known for his philosophy. It's interesting. Two of the rishonim that we're going to talk about, I think it was Rav Aaron Lichtenstein from Gush, says that in general, like most rishonim, we know that they were Talmidei Chachamim. In other words, the Rambam was a philosopher, but he was also a great, he was Talmid Chacham in terms of, Gemara. So, Rashi we know was, the Ritva, the Ramban. There's a few rishonim who we only have philosophy from. We don't know it, obviously they must have known, they knew some amount of Gemara, but were they, great Talmidei Chachamim in that regard? And one of the 3 is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. In other words, we don't have anything from him. He didn't write a Perush on the Gemara, but he's certainly one of the great philosophers. And the famous sefer that he wrote is called the Kuzari. Right? Okay, so the Kuzari, there's basically, the part that's true, it's basically, I don't even know if I would call it historical fiction, because historical fiction still tries to, there's a kernel of truth behind it, that there were the Khazars. Right? There's a big discussion today, occasionally people will claim that the Jews, one of the Jews are not really the descendants of the, they were never in Israel, that they were all the descendants of the Khazars, which, okay, there are some people who say that, but I don't think there's any, truth behind that. But there was a people known as the Khazars. They lived, I think somewhere near Russia-ish. I don't remember exactly where it is. And at some point, about 1,000 years ago, the king and his court converted to Judaism. Why? I don't know. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote a book, a philosophical book, where basically what happens, the basic premise is, there's the king, he has a dream that, God says some very famous words, kavanotecha ritzuya, ma'asecha ina ritzuya. You have good intentions. I know you're trying to serve me, but your way of doing it, sorry, you're doing it the wrong way. So he goes and he tries to gather, first he speaks to a philosopher, and then he gathers from all the different religions, and of course, coincidentally, the one who wins is the Jew, and then basically for the whole rest of the book, the conversation is, this guy who's called the Chaver, and the king, and they're having this discussion back and forth. So, 2 things we'll look at just from the Kuzari. It's broken up into different ma'amarim. So in the first ma'amar, in Chaf Chafei, I'm sorry. He's going through. He says to the king. He says, "Let's say, he's going through again. He's basically trying. This is what they did in the Middle Ages. They believed that you could prove religious things, which is going to be part of the issue that we're going to talk about. They thought you could prove God's existence. That somehow a person could not believe in God, and that you could logically convince them of it. As we'll see, that's kind of a problem. We don't really believe that anymore. And he's going through this example. He says, "Let's say I told you that there was a king in India that you should serve, and he's great, and you should just take my word." And the king, who's called the Kuzari, says, "I wouldn't serve him." So then he says, "But what if you actually got a letter from him, and then you knew he was a real person, and you learned about him?" And he says, "Oh, well, in that case, I would do it." And then, so it says the Chaver, he says, "Me'en zeh hashavaticha kasher shaltani ata b'domeh lezeh," like similar to this, "Amar Moshe b'pitach dvarim b'divrei al paro Elohei avrim shalachani elecha." Fine. Okay, so he says Moshe again when he talks about Hashem, he doesn't just say God sent me, he said Elohei Ivrim, meaning, right, Ritzon Lomar, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. Then he goes on and he says, V'chein patach ha'Eloah v'dabro el kol adap b'nei Yisrael. Hashem said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Right, and one of the questions that they're going to deal with is, what is God emphasizing here? In other words, even if you're going to say there's a mitzvah to believe in God, based on what? So it says the Kuzari, why should we believe in God? What is the pasuk saying? Anochi Hashem Elokecha, who did what? Who took you out from Egypt. Right? So he says, V'lo amar ani borei ha'olam u'borachem. He didn't say, I'm the God who created the world. And this is a big machlokah, very famous machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam. How does one arrive at belief in God? Right? The Kuzari says it's by, it's due to God's involvement in the world. That's what he said. He says over here, God doesn't say I'm the one who created the world. He says I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. Right? Right? V'chein patachti. Okay. Kasher shaltani lemunati. Right? It says basically the Jewish people, because they had this experience themselves, because they were involved with Hashem, now they know to believe in God. In other words, it's the God of history rather than the God of creation. Right? And that's what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says. That's the pasuk. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Right? And how do you know this? It's because I took you out of Mitzrayim. Okay, so according to him, it's basically, the way you come to belief in God is by seeing God's involvement in the world. Right? And it's sort of similar. Sort of similar. There's a midrash halacha in the book called the Mechilta. Right? There's a number of svarim which are midrashei halacha in the Torah, and a nice mashal. Right? We always like mashalim. Anochi, where does it say? Here we go. So it says. So the Mechilta says, "Mipnei ma lo ne'emru aseret hadibrot b'tchilat haTorah." Right? It says, why do we start off with all these stories? Right? It's a famous question. Rashi asks it in a different context. But if the aseret hadibrot is basically when God, God's revelation, and again, and whether we look at it as 10 commandments or 10 categories or whatever it is. That was a big moment. God, makes his presence known. So why isn't that at the beginning of the Torah? So, as the rabbis like to do, let's mashal hadavar domel. To what can this be compared? Le'echad shenichnas b'medina. Some guy shows up in a country and amar lehem, or in a state, and lo chalechem. All right, I want to be your king. Amru lo klum asita lanu shetimloch aleinu. Like, why should we make you king? What did you do for us? Ma'asa. So what does he do? Bana lahem et hachomah. He builds a wall around their area. Hechnis lahem et hamayim. He creates some sort of irrigation system. Asa lahem milchamot. He leads them as a general. Then amar lahem imloch alechem. Now he says, hey, can I be your king? Amru lo hein v'hein. Oh, of course. Right, kach, and right, that's the mashal. What's the name? Mashal. Hamakom hotzi Yisrael mitzrayim kara lehem hayam horid lehem haman. God took us out of Egypt. He split the sea, gave us man. Helel lehem habe'er. He gave them, the water from Be'er. Okay, and then a few other examples. Fought against Amalek. Amar lehem amloch aleim amru lo hein v'hein. Right. In other words, at what point is it reasonable for God to say, "I expect you to serve me," when He's done something for them? In other words, when they have a sense of who He is, right? If God just says, and if there was, so what it's at least saying is, that the involvement with God comes from God being involved in our life. Right? But the Kuzari, I think, is saying even a little bit more than that. Because if we look earlier in the Sefer, right towards the beginning, by Chet, what does he say right here? Okay, one second. One second. Right. He says basically that if someone comes to you, if someone were to tell you, that God is involved in your life, and you didn't, and they just said it to you as a statement. This is sort of like, again, he's going a little bit beyond the mashal that we just saw. But if someone's to say God is involved in your life, it's crazy, right? What's the only reason that we can believe that God's involved in our life is what? Because he's been involved in our life. In other words, there was actually, Yetziat Mitzrayim. In other words, up until then, if you had just told people, guess what? God cares about you. God loves you. Oh yeah? Let me see. Right? So in other words, according to the Kuzari, it's not just that we can't, we wouldn't accept, God's commandments until he took us out of Egypt, but we wouldn't be able to believe in a concept of God being involved. So he says, for the Kuzari, Yetziat Mitzrayim is the key point. But on the other hand, what you have the Rambam, and as we'll see, the Ibn Ezra as well on the other side, who say no, it's not right for them. It's not the God of history; it's the God of creation. In other words, they were both more like kind of Greek philosophers. That's where they got their framework from, and they basically believe that a person, right? How do you come to a belief in God? Not by seeing his involvement in the world, but just that if you look at the world, right, if you look at creation, if you see the complexity of the world and the fact, what we call teleology, the fact that, everything in the world functions in a way where, if we were, a few miles closer to the sun, we'd burn up. If we were a little further away, we would freeze to death. This exact thing, so they say that you can find it. And the truth is, the Rambam says it, and we'll see two different ways that he says it, which makes it a little bit complicated. But he says that that's how you arrive at a belief in God, right? The Rambam very famously, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, he lists the Taryag mitzvot, right? In other words, it's a known fact, basically, and the Gemara in Makot talks about it. We'll actually get into this a little bit more shortly, that there's 613 mitzvot. The only thing, but what are they? So there are a whole bunch of rishonim who actually, in various ways, try to list what they are. The Rambam comes up with various rules, right? It's not just saying that you're commanded once and that God commanded them in the desert, but mitzvot have to be for other generations. But the very, very first mitzvah, and it's a little complicated here because again, this was written not in the Hebrew that we have it, and it was actually written in Arabic, so there's a translation, and then, the question is, did they use the right word? But the way we have it is, mitzvah echad, the very first mitzvah, which I guess it makes sense, just like over here, hu atzivoy asher tzivanu be'emanat ha'elokim, to believe ha'elohut, to believe in God. V'hu shenamin sheyesh sham alav v'sibah, who poel l'chol hanimtzaim, right? There's a first cause, is a famous thing that, basically the one who brought the entire world into existence, right? That's the very, very first mitzvah. Sounds like the Rambam is saying is that there's a mitzvah to believe in God. Okay, that's one thing. But if you look in Hilchot, right, and then he goes through, and then Mishnah Torah basically is the unpacking of all the mitzvot. Right at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, right, in Sefer Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, he says, right, Yesod HaYesodot v'Amud HaChochmot, which by the way spells out Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is a very common thing to write out God's name. Leida. Here he doesn't say emunah. Here he says to know sheyesh sham matzoi rishon, that there is a first cause, the one who brings everything to existence. Without him, nothing would exist. Without him, there's nothing that exists like him. And he says then in Halacha Vav, v'yidiyat davar zeh mitzvat aseh shene'emar anochi Hashem Elokecha. Right? How do we know that there's a mitzvah? And here he's saying to know that God exists. Okay, and he goes through and he says that basically, if you look at nature, if you look at, the world, any true philosopher who looks at the world, it should be obvious that God exists and that you should serve. The only problem with this is, in other words, even if we say that that's true, right? In other words, we can talk about the fact, obviously the Rambam didn't know about the Big Bang, but if you think about the Big Bang, right, that there was a moment in time when there was nothing, and then all of a sudden matter comes into existence, right? So I mean, it's reasonable to say if there was nothing, and right, physical things, cause and effect. Well, if there was nothing to cause matter to come into existence, well, it must have been something that was not physical. Well, what's the only thing that's not physical that has a will? Okay, you can maybe suggest that the world suggests that there is a God, but what does that not get you to? It doesn't get you to the God of religion. In other words, the fact that, and this is what the Greeks had, in other words, the fact that, God created the world, that there is a creator, is not the same thing as saying that there is a mitzvah. But for the Rambam, again, it was a davar pashut, that philosophy will get you there. Right? And it's a little strange, because what part of the pasuk is he leaving out? Right. What about Asher Hotziticha? Right. According to the Rambam, pasuk is Ani Hashem Elokecha. Right. I am Hashem, your God. Right. And how did you find me? I don't know what it says in the rest of the pasuk, but you found me because it's obvious. It's obvious that there's a God, right? And it's very interesting. So the Ibn Ezra, actually, he has his Perush on the Torah. He also has a sefer called Yesod Moreh. So in his Perush on the Torah, it's actually very interesting. I'd never seen this before today. So in Yesod Moreh, he actually says it's mitzvah. In the Perush on the Torah, he says v'hu karov mi mitzvot halev. Okay, it's close to a mitzvah. It is a mitzvah, but basically you're supposed to believe. Then he goes through, and this is actually really interesting. I hadn't really ever thought about about the two of them. I remember when I lived in Canada, someone said to me. I lived in Vancouver, which is basically as far west as you can get, without falling off the continent. And someone said to me, "Is oh, my cousin lives in Toronto. Do you know him?" No. It's like stupid Americans, "Oh, you're from New York. Do you know my friend who lives in San Francisco?" Oh no, I guess haven't run into each other yet.
You don't associate with those kind of.
So I don't really think I never thought about this, but the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived in Spain at the same time, which, Spain's not such a small country, but they actually knew each other. The Ibn Ezra actually says, Sha'alani Rabbi Yehuda Halevi menuchato kavod. So I guess he's writing this after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi died, but he says, I asked Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Lama yizkir anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Right? Why does it have the second part of that pasuk? V'lo amar she'asiti shamayim va'aretz v'ani asiticha. Right? Sha'alani. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked the Ibn Ezra, he's saying, if really the whole thing is that you can come to God just by philosophy, so then why does it mention Yetziat Mitzrayim? The Ibn Ezra has an answer. He says there's two ways you can come to God. If you're a serious philosopher, so then you just need philosophy. You don't need any sort of experience. You don't need any sort of interaction. You can believe in God. But since not everybody's a high-thinking philosopher, there you have the second part of the pasuk. Asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Sort of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. If you're a philosopher, you got me right over there. And if you're not one of those guys, but you need some sort of tangible proof because you're not one of the great. Then Asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. That's so Ibn Ezra says basically along the lines of the Rambam. Yes, philosophy gets you there. The only, at least unlike the Rambam, who kind of doesn't really explain to you why you have the second half of the pasuk, the Ibn Ezra gives you a reason. It sounds a little forced. That it's but it's two half of the psukim are talking about two different people. But again, you have different ways of arriving at it. Different but all of them, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Rambam, the Ibn Ezra, they all say there is a mitzvah to believe in God. Now, in the past few years, I'd say maybe the last 2 to 3 years at least, I have one of my religious heroes. Unfortunately, I don't have the sefer. Actually, I have a couple of svarim about him. But I have not yet gotten my hands on the sefer. There was a philosopher who came after the Rambam, as we'll see. His name is Rav Chestai Kreskes. And the thing that I love about him, right, because at a certain point, I just, read enough of the Rambam's philosophy and saw how much it was based on Greek philosophy and how much I felt a lot of times he was just forcing in Greek ideas into Judaism without really being able to, without there being a real justification. And Rav Chestai Kreskes was one of the big rishonim who stood up and said to the Rambam, "Hold on a second." Right? He was one of the first people to basically say to him, your ideas are Greek philosophy, but they're not really what Judaism says. I just brought this along just to show you. I was actually, I don't know exactly, there's a thing that you have in Ashkenazi shuls from time to time, especially ones that have a lot of minyanim. You have these guys who will show up from time to time with a truck. like filled with svarim, and they basically set up tables and like used svarim, and you could just go in there and I mean it's like everything you can imagine. There's like old Gemarot and and Pesach Haggadot and stories about rabbis. And there was one in my community, this past week, and I actually missed the beginning of the Super Bowl, so I could go over there. I'm so frum that I buy Svarim when everybody else is watching the Super Bowl. And what I've discovered is that besides having all these, Svarim, that there's a bunch of books in there that if probably like the people in any of these shuls like knew what they were, they'd be pretty upset that they're selling these books. So like I basically like look through, like I skip all the Gemara, and I skip anything by Art Scroll, and look for kind of like these philosophical so I found this book also that it's not actually Crescus that he wrote, but it's a book about him. I mean, he's just someone who's just very, very fascinating, and he takes on the Rambam in various ways. Basically just saying he kind of is like the foil to to the Rambam, right? It's like Lex Luthor and Superman. Like he's the one who always, who always stands on. So I'm going to read from you from a book. There's a professor, I think at University of Haifa, maybe. Still alive. His name is Warren Zev Harvey. I think he's American. He made Aliyah. He's like one of the big scholars on it. So he wrote a sefer. A friend of mine actually gave it to me in Israel. It's a combination of a biography as well as spelling out his philosophy. And this is where we get to what we were speaking about beforehand. He says there cannot be a mitzvah to believe, right? Again, not that that Judaism doesn't require belief in, that in order to be a Jew, belief in God is not necessary, but there's no tzivoy to believe in God. And he actually spells out, he says that there are 3 reasons why it's impossible to say that there's a mitzvah to believe. Right? One of them that we already said is, the first one is what we'd call, is logical. Right? In other words, if you say that there's a mitzvah, right, there's a commandment, there must be a what? There must be a commander, right? In other words, just like you say, if there's a son, the term son means nothing unless there's a father. If you say someone's a father, there must be a child, right? So the same thing, like you can't have a mitzvah without a mitzaveh, right? So the first thing that Rav Kreskes points out is like, again, as we said before. Yeah, and in truth, we're going to see, to this day, very, many people ask this question. Again, it's kind of like we're saying, Gemara miman nafshach. Like, either way, it makes no sense. If you believe in God already, so you don't need a commandment. If you don't believe in God, what does that mean? What? So there's a commandment, but there's no commander? So the first thing...
That's not a problem, though, because, like you said, a couple of the rishonim say that it also means philosophically you can come to the conclusion about God, which is knowing as opposed to believing.
Right. Okay. But I'm just saying. He points out 3 different levels. But in other words, one is just to say, like, number one is just he's saying, like, very simply that it just makes you can't talk about there being a concept called a mitzvah without there being a mitzvah. And if you don't have, and again, like basically as we're going to see later on, if you don't, either you have it and the mitzvah is unnecessary, or you don't have it, in which case, like, I'm stuck. I'm sorry. I don't believe in God. What am I supposed to do? So that's his first argument. His second argument is what we said beforehand is like a philosophical argument, right? And that's what we said, like that it's belief is not a choice. You can't. In other words, like even if I want to. In other words, let's say again, I met people. I've actually a friend's nephew. I was in Israel this summer. This little boy was actually at his bris. I saw him now. He's like, 23, 24 years old, lives in Israel. And, religious family. And he's not religious. And he said to me, like, sometimes people say to me, do you believe? Are you religious? And he says, my answer is, lo zachiti. Not, I don't care. Like, I just can't. In other words, like, I'd like to. I think it's a positive thing. I look at, basically religion seems like, I can't. Right, so that's just, so in other words, like that's the thing. In other words, even if you want to, you can't get yourself to believe something that you don't believe. Like in other words, that's like and again, and Harvey brings the example. You can't believe that 2 + 2 = 5, and you can't even 2 + 2 = 4 is also not a choice. So that's the second thing, and then the third thing he says is what he calls halachic. I don't know if exact. Yeah, I guess basically he said right. So we mentioned before there's 613 mitzvot. Right? So how do we know there's 613 mitzvot? Right? It doesn't say in the Torah. So there's the pomegranate seeds. They count the pomegranate seeds. Right? So
pick the right one.
there's a Gemara Masechet Makot where it says, well, and again, like I'm sure you guys know already from me, like I'm not a big gematria guy, but this is actually in the Gemara. And again, the Gemara is not saying this is where we know it from, but I think they're saying like this is like it's an interesting hint, right? It says Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe commanded us the Torah, and if you add up the letters of Torah, what does it equal? Taf equals 400, plus Vav equals 6, that's 406. Add another 200 for the Reish, that's 606. You add Hey, that's 611. Well, that's close, but it's not 613. Where are the other two? So the Gemara says, well, Moshe, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us 611 commandments, and who gave us the other two?
Hashem.
God Himself, right? It says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotziticha lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al panai. God, right? The two mitzvot that God Himself said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am. Right? He's speaking, and right after that, it's after those first two mitzvot, then it starts. It's no longer God speaking, but it's Moshe speaking. So that's how you get to 613. But Rav Kreskes points out that if you actually do the math. And he said, that's what he said, even if you say there's 10 commandments, what exactly are they? He says, but if you actually if you actually do the math and you say that Anochi is a mitzvah, and you actually count it out, it would actually get you to 614, or according to the way the Rambam actually looks at it, you'd probably end up with 615 mitzvot. So he says, on three levels, Kreska says, there cannot be a mitzvah to believe in God. One is logically it makes no sense. Two is philosophically it makes no sense. Three is it would lead to having the wrong amount of mitzvot. Yeah.
But the problem I have with the third one is that the idea of 613 is not like an ironclad thing. It's more of like the most common belief. Like if you look at the old manuscripts of the Gemara, there's different girsas that don't have 613. They have different numbers.
I don't think I've never seen that. I mean, did you actually?
I've seen it.
Because that's the thing. Because I remember looking into does any the big question? I don't think anywhere, at least that I've seen, and I try to look into it. I was always curious. Is there a machlokah, right? Because we all know in the Gemara. They argue about everything. But is there any other number of mitzvot? But in other words, certainly at least by the time of the rishonim, it was taken as a given. And certainly even if there were earlier girsaot, but certainly for them it was taken as And again, look, that one by itself, would that be a problem? Could you somehow look? The Ramban, I didn't bring it, but the Rambam has the Sefer mitzvot, and then the Ramban actually argues with him on certain mitzvot, and then he says the Rambam was mistaken about these, and these are the mitzvot that you should. So you could do a switcheroo. You figure out what we call two mitzvot is really one. You could force it in. That by itself would not. I don't think that by itself would have. But I'm saying the other two things I think are very substantial, right? So. And again, all of this is still within this first category of belief that, right? In other words, Kreska is saying you cannot command someone to believe that which they don't believe, and if there's no commander, there's no mitzvah. So we're a little stuck over here, and so where do we go from here? So the truth is that this idea of Kreskes actually, stays for a long time. Basically, what Kreskes is saying is he's saying it's not just that there's no mitzvah. He's saying there's no mitzvah that involves belief. Right? In other words, not just that there's no mitzvah of anochi, but there's nothing that God commands you that you can't do. Which means that, in other words, any mitzvah, say, what is it always going to involve? It's always going to involve an action. And therefore, there were certain thinkers up until our day who say that Judaism is not about dogma, right? They'll even say that the Rambam's, Yud Gimel Ikarim, when he said the things that you must believe, that was not, he was doing that because he was living in a time, with the Christians and the Muslims, and they had certain beliefs, so therefore he tried to come up with a parallel idea. Saying, but that's not Judaism. Judaism is a religion of action, right? There was I think he had smicha. Moses Mendelssohn. He lived in the 18th century. It's funny, modern Orthodoxy will sometimes say, modern Orthodoxy is not a modern thing. The Rambam was modern Orthodox, and because he was a doctor and he learned Torah. The truth is, Moses Mendelssohn, people today say that he was basically the starter of Reform Judaism, but that's really revisionist history. He really was an Orthodox Jew. He was, living in give me 1 second. He was living in a modern time. He saw that, right during the Enlightenment, when people were starting to be kind of pulled by by these philosophical ideas. So he thought that he could, bring the Jewish people to believe in, give them a sophisticated approach to Judaism. It didn't exactly work out so well, and certainly in his children all ended up basically within a generation or two ended up intermarrying. I'm saying, so now he's kind of like, people, at least in certain parts of the religious world say that he was not, but he was basically non-Orthodox. We don't really count him in our group because, he failed, and we want to pretend that, non-Orthodoxy works. So
it was controversial, though.
Right? Yeah, no, of course, yeah. But again, so is the Rambam. Yeah. What do you want to say?
What about mitzvot lo ta'aseh? If you said that mitzvot are
I assume he would say this. Well, but in other words, I assume it would be something like don't. I assume he would say over there. I didn't say. Oh, I don't want to say for sure because it's a good point. But I'm saying, but certainly at least with the mitzvot aseh, he says that the mitzvot aseh are always action oriented, right? And there was even in this century there was a fairly controversial rabbi. We've mentioned Nechama Leibovich before, the woman who was she was a great teacher of Torah. She had her brother Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who was he just I don't know if he loved to be controversial or it just worked out that he was always controversial. He was famously, he basically said that the kotel had been turned into an avodah zarah and that it should be knocked down. He was a very and he also so one of his things was also the same thing, Judaism. Why do we do mitzvot? There's no philosophy behind it. There's no reasons behind it. God said to do mitzvot. Right? Why do we do them? God said so. Right? So I remember a couple of years ago, actually, they were about to name a street in Yerushalayim after Yeshayahu Leibowitz. And then I think they found some quote that he said, I think about Rav Ovadia Yosef or something. So someone from there's someone who was Sephardi, in the city council of Yerushalayim, shot it down. So he doesn't have a street named after him in Yerushalayim. But this was his approach. Basically, again, Judaism, it doesn't make, Judaism is not a religion of dogma, it's a religion of action. God commands action. What we believe, that's something else. But again, all of these things, are still with this idea, I believe that. And I think when it comes to a belief that, for the most part, I think we can agree with Kreskus that it's very hard to change it. Even though, again, as you said, the Rambam believed that he could prove God. He believed, even Rabbi Yehuda Levi believed he could do it, the Ibn Ezra. But again, the problem that we come up with is that, is that in the time of the Middle Ages, this is the way they thought. It wasn't just the Rambam, right? I recently read a biography of Thomas Aquinas, right? If you've been to, St. Thomas, right? Who was St. Thomas? He was a rationalist Christian, theologian, he was a thinker. He actually read a lot of the Rambam. He actually mentioned, he lived a little bit after the Rambam. And, again, lahavdil, but just like we have, philosophers who try to make Judaism make logical sense and not just something you believe. They believe that, they also have people who try to show that, the Trinity is philosophically possible. So you have, Thomas Aquinas. So in other words, again, and the Muslims also. In the Middle Ages, people were convinced that they could rationally convince you that God exists and that you should serve Him. As we mentioned before, the Enlightenment shook everything up, and one of the ways it shook things up is in terms of philosophy, right? In other words, because in the Middle Ages they didn't have what we would call science, right? In other words, they didn't have the whole idea, the scientific hypothesis, and you test things, and and when the Enlightenment came around, not in the way that we did. In other words, again, there were scientific ideas, but they didn't have science as a separate, right? They didn't have science as a separate discipline, right? In other words, to a certain degree, it was kind of like philosophy, kind of included all these different areas, but it wasn't like the way we have it. And in the 19th century, you have this philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who comes along and basically says, the only things that we can prove, the only things that we can rationally prove are things which are physical. And therefore he says it's not that we can, that God doesn't exist, but whether God exists or does not exist is not provable. Right? In other words, you can only do a test in science, we could only talk about something being real. Again, you could do a hypothesis on it. It could be proven true or false, right? That's the basic thing. In other words, if you have you make a claim and it's not falsifiable, that's not a scientific claim. So, basically, from that point forward, mankind has recognized, or at least those people who know philosophy have recognized that you can't prove God. Right? And you also can't disprove God. In other words, it's so in other words, so what do we do now? In other words, you have Kreskus who says you can't have a mitzvah like that. Those who you say have a mitzvah, if there is such a mitzvah, so now what? In other words, according to the Rambam, there's no problem. Just read the right things, know the right ideas, and you'll come to realize there's a God. So there's a second type of belief, not belief that, but belief in. Right? There was a famous thinker right at the beginning of the 20th century. He was not a religious guy. I mean, we would call it, religious, but he was a Jewish thinker. His name is Martin Buber. Right, and he has this famous concept of like what he talks about, like I and thou, like all this thing about like a relationship, about like relationships between man and man and man and God. That was like his big thing. And he points out that when the Torah talks about emunah, it never talks about emunah that. The Torah never says, ta'amin she, it says ta'amin be, believe in, right? Ve'aminu ba'Hashem u'b'Moshe avdo. Right? What happened? It's not that beforehand they didn't believe that Moshe existed, and now we have scientific proof, but it's trust. Right? So in other words, it could be that if we're going to talk about belief, maybe what we're talking about is maybe what the Torah might be asking of us is, rather than the Rambam's knowledge or even the other Rishonim's emunah, I command you to know I exist, I command you to believe in me, it's saying you're supposed to trust in God. Right? In other words, rather than, basically you're supposed to be faithful to God. You're supposed to, when things are not going badly, what's an example of this? Gamzo Latova, right? When things seem to be going bad, you say, no, this is for the good. Or, Rabbi Akiva's version, which is slightly less, Kol man David Rahman Latav David. I trust God that, right? Moshe, Abraham believed in God, V'yachshava lo litzdaka. Right? So, in other words, maybe rather than talking about belief that, which again is not something you can necessarily choose, maybe it's belief in, right? And this, I was listening last night, Moshe Halbertal, he gave an interesting example. I don't know if you guys, you're a little younger than me, so I don't know if you've heard of him. Anyone heard of Zachary Baumol? So in 1982, there was the war in Lebanon. That was kind of like the first real chink in like the Israeli arm, like in terms of, like they won in 48 and they won in 56 and they won in 67 and even ultimately they won in 73. And there was this sense of kind of like Israel is this invincible, and they were going to constantly beat the all the Arab countries around them. They were never going to have a problem with them. And also in 1982 they went into Lebanon. There were problems from Lebanon. They got into the war. Menachem Begin, that led to his downfall. And Arik Sharon, and some people ended up dead, which seemed to happen a lot around Arik Sharon. So what happened was that there was one battle. I don't remember the name actually. I just had it on my lips. I can't remember. But there was one battle where there was a group of tanks that were kind of attacked, and a number of and there were four soldiers who were taken hostage. One of them, probably the most famous, and the one who was most likely at least alive for some point, was Ron Arad. I don't know actually if he was in the tank. He might have actually had I don't remember, but they thought he was taken alive. And literally for years, up until at least in the 2000s, they were trying to get proof, and from time to time, some guy would come forward and say, I was in a jail and I met Ron Arad. One of the people, and again, look, you can imagine for the families, like this summer I was in Israel and I met, I went to be Menachem Avel by, Frankel's, one of the three boys who died. And the father said something interesting. He said he has such hakarat hatov for the people who found his son. Because he said, as long as it was possible his son was alive. And remember, they had heard the gunshots on the recording. We just didn't know that until the end. But as long as it was at least even possible in their minds that he was alive, they couldn't let go. There was no, right? In other words, there was still is he dead? And do we give up? He said at least when we hit rock bottom, there was a chance to go back up. So, that was the thing. These parents, the parents, there was, I think, at least Ron Arad, maybe others, I don't remember, were married. You have these wives, what do you do? And, of course, there's the halacha question, but there's also just if they're dead, you don't have them gone that you can at least say I have to move on, and you don't have them alive for sure where you could say we're going to get them back. And so one of them was this guy Zachary Baumol. Moshe Halbertal said that he was from I think Bayit Fagan also, if I'm not mistaken. And Zachary Baumol's father, who recently died, literally he spent the rest of his life trying to And again, and he basically said, that's the thing, like, even though there were all these, and that's the thing, it's not just like when you say, like, it's not like 50% chance he's alive, 50% there were various reasons, the way the tank was hit, the people who would have taken them, look, we just saw what ISIS did to the Jordanian pilot, these are not people who generally, take hostages and, do it in a manner that, that they're going to live for 20 years. There were a lot of reasons to think that Zachary Baumel was not alive, but there's still, people were praying and they were trying to negotiate and they're trying to get the Germans to serve. And Zachary Baumel's father said, like, I'm convinced my son's alive. So Howard Turrell says there's two ways that you can believe that, right? In other words, there's really doubt, right? In other words, it's not like there's no proof that he's alive. You can say, even though there's a doubt, even though there's a 99% chance he's dead, I'm going to treat that 1% as absolute. I'm completely, the way he put it is like, I feel in my heart that he's alive. I know it. I don't care what the odds say. I don't care what's likely. I know 100% that he's alive. Right? That's one form of what we'd call, believe, trusting in God. In other words, rather than the first thing that I believe that, right? Why do I believe that this is a book? Because I can, I know what a book is. I can sort of test it. It has the, but, believing in, when it comes to trust in God, it could be that, even if there's not necessarily proofs, even if I can't prove it, I'm going to live my life as if it's a certainty, right? That's one possibility. Or you could say no. You could say, even though I really don't know, even though I'm really not sure, and again, he said it to the father, it's not that I'm 100% certain he's alive. I'm really not sure, but I'm still going to act as if he's alive. Right? In other words, and this comes to a very, very important point. I wrote about this actually recently. I think this is the first time I brought a non-Jewish book, as a source. There's the first, and I would say great. I mean, maybe not everybody agrees. I think is the first great American philosopher was William James. Right? He lived about 100 years ago. I think. I believe he was educated at Harvard. He's an interesting thinker, and he has a very, very famous essay. I just read it over last night for the second time. It's called, like the title of the book, it's called "The Will to Believe." And I read a different essay. Actually, one of your brothers, Rabbi Todd Berman, who's I think the Rosh Yeshiva of Eretz HaTzvi, right? Maybe I'm making that up. I think he is. He mentioned there was a Jewish thinker, not a religious thinker, named Isaiah Berlin, who lived in England, and he also makes a similar point. We tend in general, right? In other words, kids all the time say, "Rabbi, can you prove to me that God exists?" Right? We say, the only way I'm going to believe in God, the only way I'm going to keep the mitzvot is if you can prove to me that God exists and He commanded the Torah. Right? And the truth is, we know, unlike what they thought in the Middle Ages, no, I can't. It's not just that I can't. It's you cannot prove that God exists.
Why are you so certain of that?
No, because the only things you can prove are physical things. In other words, what test is there?
True.
No, but it is true. Give me an example. What can you prove that's
when there's no other possible way?
But there is, though. In other words, that's the thing. When again, like think about it. When somebody says, last night there was that horrific crash. There was like a train crash, a Jeep got hit, whatever it is. And like someone on the way here, I was like driving over here, and I was listening on the radio, and the newscaster says, like, one of the guys who was in the crash said, I should have been dead. The only reason I'm alive is an angel saved me. Really? That's the only possibility? I mean, look, physics would say he happened to be sitting in the seat at this and this angle, and the train hit over here.
Do the math. If you
you
find out that there's no other way.
No, but there always is, though. That's the thing. In other words, whatever case you can tell me where you feel God in your heart, or you feel God, whatever, that's the thing. Like whatever story. And look, and I say this to someone who I have moments in my life. The way I met my wife, to me, I feel was Yad Hashem. Can I prove that? Of course not. I mean, that's we can't. So, but in other words, but what William James says, Isaiah Berlin says, most of life is not science. Right? In other words, it's very nice when you can prove something. It's very right. In other words, like if I pick up, I'm not going to do this. If I pick up this glass tray over here and I drop it on the floor, right? Science will say it broke because, right? And we can talk about scientifically why did it break? The material that it's made out of, it hit a hard surface, whatever, it fell at a certain speed, and whatever it is, right? However glass breaks, fine. But there's very few things in life, right? In other words, that we could say because, right? In other words, I took the class because, I thought the teacher would. It's not a because in that same sort of way. It's not a testable thing, right? He forgave him because he's a nice guy when we say that. I mean, it's not the same kind of because. It's not testable. But there's all sorts of things, Berlin says this and William James says, there's all sorts of things that we believe in which are not. You can't prove it. I mean, that's the thing. Like, most of the world doesn't work that way, right? In other words, if I say, like, okay, you know what? I refuse to get married until I know that this is the perfect woman for me and we're going to be married forever. Right? Does that make sense? Can you prove it? Is there some sort of experiment? Is there something that you can do to prove it? Yeah, still, we don't say, well, okay, you know what? Sorry, Rabbi, until you can prove to me that my wife is going to be the perfect one for me, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to get married. Right? So, both James and Isaiah Berlin say this, that's not the way we treat life. In other words, most of life we don't have proof, and yet we still act. Right? And especially when it's, in other words, there are certain things that you could be neutral on. Right? In other words, like, I'm not sure if that bungee cord, is actually, going to hold up. So, you know what, like, I'm going to play it safe. I won't do it. But in other words, when it comes to belief, when it comes to many different things, there's certain things where it's an either or. There's no such thing as doing nothing, right? Or as the great Geddy Lee. Who's Geddy Lee? Come on, someone. You listen to good music. There you go. Right. Rush, not the crazy conservative radio guy, but the music group, right? Rush?
Right. You want to go next?
Right, so Rush, the lead singer of Rush is a guy named Geddy Lee. His real name is Gary Lee Weinreb. Right, his grandmother was from Europe and she couldn't say Gary, she used to call him Geddy. So Gary Lee became Geddy Lee. And he has a famous song, even if you don't decide, you still have made a choice. Right? In other words, there's no, that's the thing, there's no such thing as like being neutral. In other words, either you practice your religion, or if you sit out, you don't. Like, you're making a choice either way. And right, and William James goes into this. I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole essay, but essentially, he says, like, that's the thing. As much as we think of it, he kind of goes against what Kreskus is saying. As much as we think of it as like belief is not a choice, to some degree, belief is really a choice. Right? In other words, to trust in someone, you don't have to be able to prove it. Right? In other words, you ever play that game, like they do this thing where like you stand up and there's a person behind you and they say like, right, trust, just fall back in there. Right? Now, in other words, you can't prove that they're going to do it, right? I mean, first it could be a practical joke. They might not be strong enough, but there's trust. In other words, you can choose. In other words, that's the thing. You might not be able to choose to believe a fact, but you can choose to trust in someone, even if you can't prove that they're worthy of it. So the same thing with God. In other words, the second thing, in other words, even if we say that you can't be made to believe that God exists or that God did a certain thing, you can maybe choose to, that's the whole title, the will to believe. You can maybe choose to a certain degree to believe things. In other words, even if you don't have absolute proof, like Baumal's father, the fact that he could say, you know what, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't have any proof. I'm not certain that he's alive, but I'm going to act as if he's alive. I'm going to trust that he's alive. So that's a second level that we can talk about. And again, and it's a very, very important thing to remember. In other words, that's the thing. Like, people are always like, religion is stupid because you can't prove it. But there's very little you can prove. Right? You can't prove that if you become a doctor that your life is going to go well, but you don't say, I'm going to refuse to take a job until, I can prove that it's going to be successful. You can't prove, you can't prove that if you, move to Israel that your life is going to be better than America, but people make aliyah. You can't prove that democracy is better than communism, but, people will still make that claim. In other words, what James points out and Isaiah Berlin points out, he's talking about in the context of history, is there's plenty of things that we know even though we can't prove it. Right? Or even like, the example, right? In other words, can anybody here prove it that you were not created last Tuesday with false memories of a life that goes back 20 years? Can you prove? Can you give me a concrete, right? Whatever it is you're going to say. But I remember. No, but those are your false memories. But my parents remember. Oh no, but they were. Everyone was created. Everyone was created last Tuesday. The world is really only 8 days old. Everything, right? Now, can we prove that? Can we prove that we really have existed for more than? No, we cannot.
I bet against it.
Right. No, but that's the point. That's essentially what Berlin is saying, what James is saying. In other words, that there's plenty of things in life that we know, even though we can't prove it. Right? Not know in the sense of like scientific knowledge, but most of life does not involve scientific knowledge. So, in other words, even if we can't, even we'll say like, I can't choose to believe that God exists, we might be able to, in other words, this second level of belief, belief in, I can still choose to trust that, that God is there. I can still live a life of living as if God is there. And in other words, and with all that involves, not just like, I was actually arguing with somebody about this online today, but I think you could, people say, well, what about the mitzvah? Yeah, well, but if I believe God exists and I believe He gave the Torah, even, I trust in God that He did these things, even though I can't prove it, I keep the mitzvot. I don't keep the mitzvot just because, the Rambam would say, why do you keep the mitzvot? Because God exists, God commanded, and therefore you do it, right? Whereas, in this category, we would say, why do we keep the mitzvot? Because I trust that God exists and that God, that this system is true. Okay, it's a different type of belief. But then there's a third type of belief, and this is actually very interesting. In Hebrew, he called it emunah keh, right? Believing like. What does that mean? So, let me just... I'll tie this in over here. Fine. Believing, in other words, let's say a person, right? He gave an example, and I think it's a good one. Although we can come with let's say someone's an environmentalist, right? Like let's forget Al Gore, but a person who's an environmentalist generally is not going to fly around in private jets. They're generally not going to buy a car that gets 6 miles to the gallon. They're generally, there's a certain, worldview that you have as an environmentalist, right? In other words, there's certain, in other words, if you met an environmentalist, but they were driving, like a big Cadillac, and they had a ranch in Texas, you'd be like, no, because being an environmentalist, it's almost like a religion, right? Like, you have to be from, you're generally from one of the two coasts. You either live, near the village. You live in San Francisco. You tend to, you recycle. You generally think that the government should be involved in people's lives, that you can make it better. In other words, there's a worldview, right? In other words, when you become in other words, there are certain things that we do, we take on a certain persona, right? Or in other words, an example he gave is, in other words, let's say a judge, right? A judge lives in a place where there's a death penalty. And there's a case that comes before him, and, where someone's supposed to be put to death. As a judge, if the person's guilty, what do they have to say? As a judge, I found him guilty, and he's going to be put to death. As a regular person, I think the death penalty is awful. In other words, but in his role as a judge, he has to think a certain sort of way, whereas in his role as a regular person, he could think in a different way. So, what Halbertal suggests is that there's a third type of belief. We believe as. In other words, when it comes to Judaism, maybe it's not that you believe because you can prove it, or you just trust God, but why do you believe? Because it's part of the system, right? In other words, you don't accept the belief because it's just, you're believing as a Jew. As a Jew, we say that God, took us out of Egypt. We say that God gave us the Torah. Can you prove that? Is it something rationally you can demonstrate? But in other words, it's part of the package. In other words, and here's going to be, I'll give an example. Like, how does this come into play? Rather than, so Leibowitz says, why Judaism just has mitzvot, right? In other words, God commanded mitzvot, you just have mitzvot. Here, there's a different role for the mitzvot, right? In other words, if you want to be an environmentalist, right? In other words, let's say you want to get somebody to be an environmentalist, how would you, how do you get them to do it, right? You wouldn't say to them, let me prove to you why environmentalism is very, very important. What happens? A person comes and they start to live in that, right? And there's, maybe a certain type of music they listen to, and there's a certain type of politics, and there's a whole
culture.
There's a whole culture around it. There's a whole and basically, so when you're part of that, you accept certain things, right? In other words, even if you really, you grew up really liking Mustangs, you're not going to drive one anymore.
Why
right?
are they accepting something?
Well, no, but in a certain sense, it's a choice. You choose to be part of a community, and therefore you accept its outlook. In other words, what it's really saying, and what Halatorah is saying, and I know this is like controversial, but I think there's a certain degree of truth in this, is that he says, like, if you think about it, how do we, those of us who are observant Jews, or observant anything, how do we come to believe that, right? In other words, it's not, is it that, like our parents told us when we were children,
yes,
there's God.
Yeah.
Now let me tell you, okay, there's, God has the following traits. A God who has the following traits is capable. No, in other words, what happens? We keep Shabbat, we keep Kashrut, we sing, we sing certain songs, we pray, we do all these actions, and we're acting as Jews. And what happens ultimately? Since we're acting as Jews, what happens to us? You think like a Jew. You believe certain things, right? I mean, to some degree, that's the thing. In other words, I don't care if I could prove it. I don't care what, my life is based on, this idea over here. It's thinking as a Jew. In other words, it's almost like, the way we usually think of it is I believe in God and therefore I keep mitzvot. But I recently read a book by a non-Jewish thinker who kind of said this in general with religion. But it's almost like a language or a culture. In other words, what is if again, the same way you said, right, like a culture or when you live in a certain community, what is that? When you become a part of it, right? You talk about a Baal Tshuva. You talk about someone who becomes a member. I've been reading this book. I'm reading this book about umpires. There's this guy who basically he spent this time going through the whole training program to become an umpire and interviewed them or whatever it is. And there's a mindset when you're an umpire. There's a certain way of thinking. You believe that everybody hates you, right? These guys they're and partially for justified reasons. They're a little they're a little the fans hate us, the players hate us, the owners hate us. And again, that's the thing. If you go through the system, you become an umpire. In other words, you can imagine a guy coming in at 18, 19 years old, and he thinks, it'd be nice to be an umpire. I've been a little league umpire. It was very nice. I like baseball. I'm not going to be a player. I'll be part of it. Right? But after 5 years in the system, after 10 years in the system, and you hang out with other people, and after the game, you go out and drink together, and you talk, right? You become part of the culture, and therefore, right? In other words, it's not that you can, you sign, you test it, and you go around and you poll the fans, and 82% of the fans hate me, and 96% of the players, and 100% of the owners, and therefore no. But it's, in other words, the culture of being an umpire. Part of that is a certain worldview, right? So to a certain degree, and again, it is to a certain. It's a choice. In other words, if you choose to be part of the religious Jewish community, there are certain beliefs that come with that, right? And even Rav Soloveitchik said this to a certain degree, right? I mean, Rav Soloveitchik actually said, here, what page is this? This is in a book that we actually spoke about a little bit earlier in the year. Rav Soloveitchik said, right, in other words, Rav Soloveitchik was very into the Rambam. But one of the things that Rav Soloveitchik did, I heard a rabbi this summer in Israel say this. He said Rav Soloveitchik's ideas are very nice, they're just not always true. Right, which, okay, he was actually a Talmud of Rav Soloveitchik. But anyway, Rav Soloveitchik says, the Rambam says there's a mitzvah to know that God exists. The thing is, Rav Soloveitchik's living in the 20th century. He knows philosophically we're not capable of knowing that God exists. So he says, what does the Rambam mean? He says, you have to live in a way like someone who knows that God exists. In other words, it's not that you have to be able to prove it, but that your life has to be one that is completely based on that process, right? In other words, when it comes to, loving someone, right? In other words, what does it mean to love someone? That, everything you do, one way or another, is somehow, if the woman that you're going to marry, part of the fact that you work, the fact that you don't go out, drinking when they're going out, whatever it is, the things that you do. In other words, your actions demonstrate that you love this person, right? So Rav Soloveitchik says that we can as religious people we're supposed to not just have beliefs that God exists, but we're supposed to live like God exists. It's not supposed to just be some sort of mental process. We're supposed to behave in that sort of way, right? If you really love someone, it's you can tell, right? Your friend all of a sudden, he stops showing up, going out with the guys, whatever it is, and his whole, he's always did you see what, you're always talking about it. Again, what Rav Soloveitchik's trying to do, is to suggest that it's not our beliefs that lead to our actions, but it's our actions that lead to our beliefs. If you live as a religious Jew, part of that package is believing that God exists. Which again, I get what you're saying, that it feels uncomfortable, but the fact that it feels uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not true in the sense of objectively true, but to a certain sense, that's the way it works. In other words, if you like Shabbat and if you like kashrut and you live within that culture, it comes with a certain system that you just kind of
I don't agree.
accept. Well, go ahead. What do you mean?
It's just like I can go to a class and then shul and then but then just not enjoy it at all and just
right. No, but at that point, what are you going to do though?
Huh?
You were in the wrong group.
No. But that's the thing. At that point, what's going to happen if you decide that that's what Halbert was saying. Halbert was saying when a person decides I want to be religious, or I don't want to be religious. It's not that they first test out certain things and they can prove it in one direction. In other words, think about it. How does the average person become a Baal Tshuva? Right? In other words, does it involve sitting down with, like the Rambam, let me show you a cell, and isn't it incredible? Who else could have existed? It's like, come over to my house for Shabbat, right? And if you're Ashkenazi, I'll give you cholent, which somehow is going to somehow make you love Judaism. I don't know. And, it'll be so nice, and people come over, and they see, it's a cultural thing. And, it's so nice, the children, they sit at the table, and they're well behaved, and they sing songs, and they have meaningful conversations, right? In other words, that's what it's saying. In other words, if you just, you're right. You might
just not be your thing, no matter how much you immerse yourself in a culture.
Right, no, but that's the thing. But that's the point. And at that point, in other words, you're going to leave not because you not because you don't believe, but because it doesn't work for you, and therefore the beliefs fall away. But in other words, it's not the beliefs. It's not basically what he's saying is
you should know, you should just like what you're doing. Maybe that's just me.
Right. But that's what he's saying. He's saying that in other words, because you like what you're doing, you become a part of that culture. And if that culture stops working for you, that's the thing. A lot of people when they walk away from religion, it's not like this is great. A lot of people, I wouldn't say always. In other words, I think there are people who really have intellectual, but in other words, some of it is just, it stops working. In other words, just like my whole lifestyle. You have a kid who, I remember when I was living in Florida, there was this kid, he went to SUNY Binghamton, which, the picture's on Facebook from SUNY Binghamton, we'll just say. He went to SUNY Binghamton.
Look at
It must be very, very warm because there's not a lot of clothes that people wear. But anyway.
That's during the winter.
Anyway, I remember there was this guy, I think this was in this is 1998, so I think this is really before the internet was really a thing. But I remember there was this guy, there was a student of mine, a 6th grader, his brother would call, he was at SUNY Binghamton, he was on his way, from Binghamton to Boston is about 5 hours. He was on his way driving to Boston, I would say for Shabbat, except for the fact that would imply that there was going to be Shabbat. He was driving there, and he would he'd pull over at the side of the road. That was the pre-cell phone era. He'd go to a payphone, and he'd call up and he'd say, "Yeah, hi, Mom and Dad. I'm getting ready, for Shabbos. I'm taking a shower. Yeah, I'm going to be going over to Chabad later. Okay, have a great Shabbos." And then get back in his car and continue driving to Boston and do a lot of things, but Shabbos wasn't part of that, right? So that's the thing. In other words, but it wasn't in other words, a guy gets to college and basically discovers whoa, I can have a really, really good time here. At that point, what happens? He stops. It's not that the beliefs fall away and therefore he starts doing it, but in other words, he decides that the lifestyle that comes with being an observant Jew isn't working for him.
But for those type of people, sometimes they'll come back.
Sometimes
they'll come through. Someone who's 13 and they're just
ruining all the fun.
I really don't like
That's
this, and I don't like that I'm being told that, and whatever. However it works. That person just that wasn't good for them. They're not coming back. That's more of a cognitive.
No, I mean you're right, but again, my point though is just that again that it's not. In other words, and if you ask that person, it's not like they're going to say, "Oh yeah, I perfectly believe. I think it's all true. I just, I don't care." They'll say, "Oh, I don't believe in it." But what happened first? First they saw okay, I could keep all the rules, and I'm going to really, my roommate's going to have a much better college experience than me, or I can let it go. And then once I let it go, then they're oh, okay, it seems to not be true. But it's not, in other words, it's not the reverse order. And again, not always, but at least sometimes. I'll just share with you 2 other ideas that I think are part of this. One of which is I think a very interesting modern idea. But one of them, there's a rabbi by the name of Rav Elchanan Wasserman. He was the Talmid Muvhak of the Chafetz Chaim. Right? He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Baranovich. Very famously, he was killed by the Nazis al Kiddush Hashem. There's a story which maybe or maybe not that happened exactly the way it is, but they were basically in the yeshiva. They knew they were going to be killed. Very famous story where he tells the students, you should accept this. They were dying al Kiddush Hashem, just like a korban. You're not supposed to have an improper thought. You shouldn't question God. He's a very, very from guy. But in this book, which actually were bought for me by a couple of friends of mine, although of course I lost it. This is actually a replacement copy. But these friends bought it for me. The very, very first essay, he asks our question. He actually asks a bunch of questions, and I think he'll actually appreciate them. Right? Number one, he asks our question of Kreskis' question. Although he doesn't mention Kreskis, I don't know if he knew who he was, didn't know. Well, I'm sure he knew who he was. I don't know if he learned Jewish philosophy. But he says number one, how can you know that God exists? Number two, how can there be a mitzvah? Right? In other words, either you believe already and there's no need for a mitzvah, or you don't believe, and how could you believe? Then he says, non-Jews, according to at least like the general approach to Judaism when it comes to the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, they have to keep those, otherwise they don't get Olam Haba. But what if you live in Iowa or in Africa or somewhere and you've never heard of God? Like, why should you lose out just because you were never given the chance, right? And then he goes through. He says also, he says, how do we expect a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old by their bar mitzvah to believe? Like, how could that be? So he comes up with a theory which I don't think really holds up philosophically, but which I think could teach us something very interesting. He says as follows. He says, according to him, and I don't think this is true philosophically, but he says, according to him, he sort of says like what the Rambam says. He says, anybody who looks at the world objectively will know that God exists. He says the complexity of the world and the way it's created, and again he uses the famous example, just like if I came in and this book had writing and I said, like, it's crazy, I went to sleep, there was, I woke up, my pet cat, was playing around with the pen and wrote all these words here. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it's like 12 shiurim, just randomly written by my cat. You say, no, that just doesn't work. Right? Or the famous example is like the watchmaker. Right? If there's a watch, someone must have made it. Right? So that's where. Now again, I say, even if you say that that's true, that's not going to get you the belief. But he says something very interesting. He says so why? He says if that's true, why doesn't everybody believe in God? Right? So it's like this connects to what we said before, right? Think about it. Why doesn't everybody believe in God if it's so obvious? So, because again, like I used to say to students, right? You don't want, I'd say sometimes you don't want to believe that God exists, right? Because if God exists, it's like soon, if you believe that God exists, Saturday night is a whole lot less fun than if God doesn't exist, right? In other words, it's just like, and therefore he says, very interesting, and this is the part that I think is very interesting. He says, therefore, he says, you're what we call in Torah nogea b'davar. You're not. In other words, he said a neutral scientist, at least in theory, is supposed to be willing. It doesn't make a difference to him if his thesis is proven or disproven. He wants the truth. But this guy over here, right? And what does the Torah say? Ki hashochad ya'aver pichim v'yisalef divrei tzadikim. Right? What happens if if you're bribed? What happens if you want a certain outcome?
Yeah. You're going to see.
You're going to see that. That's what you're going to see. So he says, and here's the interesting thing. He says, how could there be a mitzvah to believe? So he says the mitzvah. Just look at me. I think you'll like this. The mitzvah to believe is not that you're supposed to believe in God, but you're supposed to act in a way that will make it. That in other words, that will not have you be drawn after not wanting to believe in God. Right? In other words, if you hang out in clubs, or the SUNY Binghamton dorms, again, you're going to want to not practice these things. In other words, what Rav Chanan is saying is that the mitzvah to believe is not God commands you must believe this fact, but God is saying to you, do actions that make it likely that you will believe. Not again, and now this gets around this whole idea of kreskes. In other words, it's not saying, I command you to believe, and then you say, but I don't believe in you, so how are you commanding me? Or, but I can't. I want to believe, but I can't. So no, in other words, it's not about belief, but in other words, act in a way that it's likely that you'll be, right? In other words...
So that's like with the saying, okay, you're gay, so go to straight bars and go to hang out with straight people, and you won't be gay anymore.
No. But in other words, but the difference is what he's saying over here is that he's saying that in other words, he's saying no one's born with either a desire to believe in God or a desire not to. But in other words, but he's saying, but rationally, and again, I disagree with this claim, but essentially he's saying rationally, if your mind doesn't get polluted, you'll come to belief in God. So he's saying don't, right? So in other words, like, again, I'll give you an example. Can we guarantee that, that your relationship with when you get married, you go to a wedding, so exciting, Mazal Tov, Mabruk, the whole thing, right? Everyone's so excited. Can you guarantee that in, 5 years you're not going to, fall in love with your secretary or someone in Aruba? No, but what you can do is you can commit to behave in a way that's unlikely to happen, right? In other words, hire male secretaries only, or stay away from certain types of establishments, or don't go to www.destroymysoul.com. In other words, right, exactly, right. Basically, what he's saying is right. So in other words, according to Rav Elchanan, the mitzvah would be, in other words, you're right. I can't command you to believe, but what I can expect of you is act in a way that makes it at least possible. Again, like that's the thing. He's not, what I'm suggesting a little bit different than what he's saying is that it's not that it's not that action. This is unlike the part that Sammy and you didn't like, but what I think actually probably for many people it actually becomes true. But it's not that it's not that your actions must lead to belief, but at least if you do certain things, there's at least a puncher's chance. That in other words, if you do the mitzvot and you stay away from, like that's the thing. In other words, like I was always bothered, like why is what is God afraid of? Why can't we read books that talk about religion not being true? God can't. If God's true, we should be able to do it. But and maybe it's not like like imagine like a husband saying to his wife like. I'm going to look at certain websites, but like what you're not secure enough that I'm going to still find you beautiful, but that's essentially what it is. It's saying that in other words, again, do certain actions so that the outcome is likely to be belief. So in other words, that's the thing. In other words, that's kind of like a possibility for today. In other words, we can't convince. Right. In other words, try to make it possible. In other words, do actions that at least make it possible. Right. That in other words that sometimes right na'aseh v'nishma. Right. If we do an action, we'll come to appreciate God afterwards. But if you do the wrong kind of action, you're less likely to do it. So in other words, what I think we can maybe take away from Rav Elchanan Wasserman is the idea that there could be a mitzvah not believe something that you don't think is true, but act in a way so that it's a possibility that it will happen. You wanted to say something to that? All right, and finally, one last point, which is totally out of left field. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I personally think my mind is more than polluted, and I am very, very. I believe in God. I believe in the religion. I'm afraid of God. I fear God.
Right, but I'll give you an example. I won't say who this was, but the other again, like I wrote this. I wrote this blog post the other day. I think it was actually fairly good, on this topic. That, in other words, that again, it's not that you should be able to just, accept religion and it doesn't, just without any proof. But I'm just saying, but you shouldn't expect you shouldn't expect any more from a religious person than you expect from yourself. Like, in other words, we don't live. Most of our lives are not lived scientifically. We believe things. We know. Right, in other words, we know we were not created last Tuesday, even though we can't prove it. We know that we're all in this room, even though we can't prove that we're not a brain and hooked up to electrodes in a lab somewhere. We know it, even though we can't prove it. We know it, right? So so I wrote this thing, and there was a discussion going back and forth. And one guy, maybe who happened to have been in your grade, maybe not, but maybe wrote.
What might have been his name?
Wrote, Rabbi. I can almost. That's funny. He wrote, Rabbi. Don't people make it so complicated? Just believe. Just like don't overthink it, Rabbi. Like it's funny. I could totally hear his voice. I haven't seen him in a while, but I could totally hear him saying this. And I said back to him, I said, okay, it's very nice. Again, and James gets into this. I didn't get to this side of things. But in other words, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, I believe in God in a kind of in a demand, in a
forceful way.
No, in a way that it doesn't come with anything. Like, in other words, it's like you could be in a relationship with someone. If someone says, look, I don't care if you cheat on me, and I don't care if you run around, and I don't care if you do anything, you don't have to get me flowers. but I just want to be your girlfriend. Like, that's a pretty easy relationship to be in. Like, in other words, so that's the thing. In other words, belief in God, just in terms of like, oh yeah, I believe in God, and maybe I believe that, maybe I have to give tzedakah so He won't punish me. But in other words, belief in God, again, that's why we said, like, the famous thing, like Karl Marx said that religion is the opiate of the masses. Mm-hmm. So I said, like, many religions are the opiate of the masses. Buddhism is the opiate of the masses. Maybe Christianity is. Orthodox Judaism is not the opiate of the masses, right? In other words, it's not like, it's very nice to have a God who kind of, right, it's, right. It's very nice to have a God who's kind of like your buddy, like sometimes you speak to some of the kind of like the more simple, Christian people who like, you've got a friend in Jesus, like, that's a very nice thing. But a God who demands you to like, fast several times a year and stay in synagogue and not touch your wife for 12 days a month and not eat all these, and not eat all these, eat all these foods. So I'm just saying, like, in other words, to say, I believe in God, but in other words, but like, I'm talking about getting to the point, again, not just belief, but a belief that leads to action. That you're gonna invest your life heavily in that. Again, I'm not, again, to say like, I believe in God, I've got a friend in Jesus, like, it was kind of weird to me, like, sometimes when I'd be around evangelicals, like, women who had stuff that was, like, down to here, but like, Jesus, and it's like, of course, it's easy to say, like, it's easy, if there's no rules, like, God's awesome, I have a little buddy who keeps me safe, but in other words, but Judaism says, like, 613 mitzvot, see that pretty girl over there? Don't go near her, okay? If you want, when you're 23, if she's Jewish, you can marry her, and then you'll be able to touch her for 18 out of every 30 days.
Which people...
I'm just saying, like, unless your mind is... You're going to have to be pretty committed. Again, that goes beyond just like, I believe in God. That's like, I believe in God, and therefore I'm will. It's like, I love this woman to the point where, even though, I have, 30,000 women throwing themselves at me, I would never touch them. That's what I'm talking about in terms of belief. In other words, it's a belief which comes with consequences. In other words, where it's going to change the way you act.
So it's like a relationship.
Yeah. In other words, I
wouldn't really compare it to a relationship because, it's religion.
But first of all, God compares it to it. I mean, if you look, shiur shiurim according to Chazal is, the whole thing is, it's a husband and wife, lecha dodi. That's what it is. It really is. It's not just, the mitzvah to believe in God would not just be like, believe that, God exists. It would mean believe that God exists and that He expects you to live a certain way and He's involved in your life and that there's schar va'onesh and that there's, in other words, it comes with a whole bundle of activities. All right. So one last thing I just want to get to. I met this guy this summer. He's actually, I think he's kind of like important for the Jewish people these days because the truth is, like, most academic people, certainly in terms of like academic Bible and, and archaeology and stuff like that, most of them are not, the friends of Orthodox religion. In other words, like, most of what they're teaching, right? if you go into an average Bible course at, any university, you're unlikely to come out of there with stronger emunah, that in God and the Torah and whatever. And that can be disconcerting because, especially, like, if you like to, we like to think that our religion is based on, we're not just like suckers who believes in it, we've thought it through and it's logical. That's difficult. So Joshua Berman, he lives in Israel. He's actually a rabbi. He's a doctor. He's a PhD. He teaches at Bar Ilan. He's actually like one of the only guys in the field who's really like pushing back. When people are saying like, there's 4 different authors and there was one guy, there was a redactor and it was written in the 8th century in Babylon. Not the Jews never went out of Egypt. All this stuff, which you read and you're like, and Joshua Berman is actually pushing back. He's basically trying to show, like, from a scholarly perspective, that they're wrong. So he wrote a very, very interesting book. I'm only partially through it. I have this horrible habit of, starting like 16 books, all at the same time. So I have like 5 books on my, on my dresser that I'm reading at different points. So I'm only like 60 pages into this, even though I've had it for a while. But he talks about this idea. I never heard of this before. And again, this is something that I've talked about. I know we're running a little bit late tonight. But just a little, Victor. I appreciate you not ditching. Yeah. But I'll really wrap it up with this. I've mentioned this beforehand, that when we talk about Dibrat Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam, when we talk about the idea that the Torah is written in man's language, doesn't mean it was written for a 21st century person. It's not meant for a person who lived at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Berman points out there's this word here. I think I'm going to pronounce it the right way. None of you will know whether I get it right or not, but we could look it up. I don't know. There were these treaties in the ancient world. We're talking about like 3,000 years ago. I believe it's pronounced suzerainty. It's treaties, and basically what it was. Thank you. And basically what they were is that you would have a powerful, let's say you'd have like a powerful king and a less powerful king, and they would be like, a big brother, little brother relationship. That basically there would be a treaty that would be signed by them, and the big brother, the big king would protect the little king from everybody else, and in return for that, the little king had to be loyal to him. And he points out, and again, this was like a very standard thing, and we have records of it. In other words, this is not, there's certain things that we talk about, like the ancient world, and it's like maybe. We have records. There were these treaties that existed in ancient Mesopotamia, and wherever it was. And again, there was a deal, like, you'll be loyal to me, and I'll protect you.
Yeah.
And he suggests,
It's called something.
right, and it's called the suzerainty treaty, or however.
I'm saying like that relationship.
Right. So there were these treaties, and he points out, he says that there was a standard form that they had. In other words, the beginning of it was kind of like there was like a introduction which said, here's why, why you should be loyal to me. This is what I've done for you. This is this is the way I've treated you up until now. And then there would be rules of the deal. And he says, if you look at it, the Aseret HaDibrot works the same way. He says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha is that introduction. I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Right? In other words, I'm the big king. You're Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. Right? You're little kings. In other words, it's not like you're my slaves, but you're like a, we use the term vassal state, but that's like kind of like an insult to a country. He's saying like, so he's saying, and then the rules are the mitzvot of the Aseret HaDibrot. He says, if you really, and again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing over here right now because I have gone way over, but right back there. But he says if you compare these treaties to the Aseret HaDibrot, basically what God is saying is like, this is the kind of you all know about these kind of treaties. The pharaohs might have gone into it. The Assyrian rulers might have gone into it. This is the relationship that we're going to have. And according to him, then Anochi is not a mitzvah, but it's an introduction. And again, he's saying that the Torah is written in a way, and the truth is he goes through the entire thing, and it's actually pretty cool. He actually shows that if you look at the Torah from the eyes of ancient man who actually received it, that it actually matches up to the way they thought right back then. That's his whole big theory. He actually says in terms of a lot of the questions that they have and contradictions in various places that different Bible scholars use to show that it's really not true. He has his whole theory where he shows that it really, if you look at the way they thought right back then and legal systems worked back then. So again, he's just saying in terms of the Aseret HaDibrot, just like as a totally separate idea, rather than Anochi being a mitzvah, Anochi is this introduction which explains to us why we should keep the mitzvot, that I'm Hashem who took you out, just like these suzerainty treaties, or suzerainty treaties as I've been corrected over here by the expert in the ancient Near East. He's just saying like that's the way the Aseret HaDibrot is formed. And it's just, it's a much longer theory. And I apologize for keeping you particularly late, but I hope at least it's been at least somewhat thought provoking.